Today's reading is Psalm 39, which can be found in page 494 of your pew Bibles. I said, I will watch my ways and keep my tongue from sin. I will put a muzzle on my mouth while in the presence of the wicked. So I remained utterly silent, not even saying anything good. But my anguish increased. My heart grew hot within me. While I meditated, the fire burned. Then I spoke with my tongue. Show me, Lord, my life's end and the number of my days. Let me know how fleeting my life is. You have made my days a mere handbreadth. The span of my years is a nothing before you. Everyone is but a breath, even those who seem secure. Surely everyone goes around like a mere phantom. In vain they rush about, heaping up wealth without knowing whose it will finally be. But now, Lord, what do I look for? My hope is in you. Save me from all my transgressions. Do not make me the scorn of fools. I was silent. I would not open my mouth. For you are the one who has done this. Remove your scourge from me. I am overcome by the blow of your hand. When you rebuke and discipline anyone for their sin, you consume their wealth like a moth. Surely everyone is but a breath. Hear my prayer, Lord. Listen to my cry for help. Do not be deaf to my weeping. I dwell with you as a foreigner, a stranger, as all my ancestors were. Look away from me, that I may enjoy life again, before I depart and am no more. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Good morning again. Just a reminder as we're moving forward in this sermon series, particularly this month of it, we're hanging out in the Psalms all summer, but in this month we're paying particular attention to what it means and what it looks like to pray the Psalms. Not just to read the Psalms, and there's great edification just even in reading the Psalms, and not just studying the Psalms, and obviously there's great fruit to be had from studying the Psalms too, but to take it a step further and pray the Psalms. The Psalms are a school of prayer. They're given to us by God to teach us how to pray, to show us rhythms for how to pray. And so we'll keep that in mind this morning as we look through Psalm 39. If you want to have the Bible open in your lap as we move forward, Psalm 39, there are 4 stanzas. Now, if we were studying Psalm 39, we might begin by noticing that in the first stanza, the psalmist here has a lot to say about the power of words, and that what we say is really significant and powerful. In fact, David here expresses that he's being very careful to hold his tongue because he recognizes that at times what we say can be destructive and even sinful. If we were studying this psalm, we might even pause and reflect on this phrase that he mentions here when he says, I will guard my mouth with a muzzle. And we might pause to picture that and imagine in his day as in ours how a muzzle is something that you put on thoughtless animals that are hard to control. And we might picture a muzzle being forcefully put onto an animal to keep it from being able to bite others. And we might reflect on the fact that sometimes we need that spiritual discipline to muzzle ourselves. If we were studying this psalm, we might go on, we might even turn our thoughts to James 3, which is a New Testament expression of this, where in James 3, James reflects on the disproportionate power that such a small part of the body can have. We might even quote from James 3 where he said, for how great a forest is set afire by such a small flame. And reflect on the power of our words. But we're not studying this psalm, so we won't do any of that this morning. Instead, we're considering what it means to pray this psalm. And so instead, let us notice in the first stanza that there is great human drama being built up here. David has something he wants to say, but he refuses to say it in front of wicked people. Now, we're going to get into what he wants to say, but just notice at this point, what he wants to say to God. But he doesn't want to say it in front of people who don't yet know God, because he fears that he might sully the name of God in the minds of other people. And he doesn't want to do that. So David is holding his tongue. He's muzzling himself in front of these people who don't know God. But the human drama builds as David reflects in stanza 1, I have something to say, but I'm going to hold it. And then you just almost see him start to shake because he can barely hold it in. We read these words, David's distress grew worse. His heart grew hot within him. Have you ever had your heart grow hot within you? In stanza 1, it says, as he was musing over his distress, musing over what he wanted to say to God, it was like he could barely contain it. He couldn't hold it in. And the more he mused over it, the hotter it grew inside of him. This is the human drama that we see in stanza 1. Psalm 39 is a psalm of distress. It is Job-like, actually, in its posture, and has quite a bit of similarities with Job and his prayers of distress. Now, before we get to what David is fed up with and what he wants to say to God, it's important to ask the question, how do you pray Psalm 39? How do you pray a prayer of distress? Well, if you are experiencing distress in your life, if this distress has filled you with questions, maybe even questions for God, then praying this psalm, as we see in the first stanza, invites us to not hide from those questions, to not hide from the heat that distress sometimes puts inside of us. David doesn't hide from it. He muses over it and it grows hot within him. And there's a lesson in that. I got an email this week from a sister in our congregation who's experiencing pain and suffering in life, and more importantly to her, there are people near to her who are experiencing real suffering right now. And her email to me was not short, and it was filled with questions, and some of them had some heat behind them, as she was really grappling with how do you deal with suffering, and what do you do with that? And how do you make sense of God in the midst of that? I got the email while I was working on this sermon. And I wrote back and I said, take a look at Psalm 39. This is a great psalm for those who are in distress. And so if any of you here today are in distress, part of what this psalm teaches you is don't hide from that. Don't shove it down and pretend it's not there. Let it grow hot within you. Muse over these things. But what about those of us, maybe you're sitting there thinking, I should have skipped church because I'm not in distress right now. I mean, I was last week, and I probably will be again next week, but this week I'm not in distress. How do you pray a psalm of distress when you're not in distress? Similar to what we talked about last week, that part of how you pray any psalm still applies to psalms of distress. That you pray a few verses, you read a stanza, and then you pause and you let your heart catch up to it. And you find out ways that maybe the psalm itself provides momentum for your own prayers or gives language to your own prayers. Even if you don't need it right now, right? There's a way that praying the psalms is intended to prepare us for life. The psalms are intended to arm us with spiritual muscle memory. where we learn how to pray certain prayers so that when we need them, they're inside of us. Similarly, I find it remarkable that in Jesus' day, the Jewish boys between the age of 7 to 14 would go to synagogue school. 7 to 14. And one of the first things that they were asked to do in synagogue school was to memorize the first 7 chapters of the book of Proverbs. Now, don't just be amazed that they would begin by memorizing 7 chapters of a book of the Bible. Like, we're good if we memorize 7 verses, right? They would memorize 7 chapters. But if you haven't been in Proverbs 1 through 7 lately, consider that it is mostly, not all, but mostly about temptation and how to deal with temptation, specifically sexual temptation. Think about this for a moment. You have 7 and 8-year-old boys who are memorizing wisdom literature about how to deal with temptation, most specifically sexual temptation. They didn't understand any of it. But they had it inside of them for when they needed it. Does that make sense? And that was the wisdom of the synagogue school. Let's get these rhythms, let's get this wisdom inside of them. They're gonna need it. And similarly, even if you're not in distress right now, there's something important about praying a psalm like Psalm 39 to learn some of the muscle memory so that when you are in distress, and is distress going to come? Yes. And God knows that. And God wants to prepare us for how to be in distress with Him. And the first stanza is this lesson to not hide from it, to not hide from the questions, but to muse over them like David did. Now, if we were studying Psalm 39, we might now move on to the second stanza and note that in the second stanza, David clarifies a lot about the fleetingness of life. As he puts it in verses 4 and 5, O Lord, make me know my end and what is the measure of my days. Let me know how fleeting I am. Behold, you have made my days a few handbreadths, and my lifetime is as nothing before you. Surely all mankind stands as a breath. Exclamation mark. If we were studying this psalm, we might pause and take note that a handbreadth was one of the smallest measurements that mankind had at the time in their culture. In other words, how do you measure a human life? In millimeters. There's not much to it. We might compare this sober assessment that David has in stanza 2 with Ecclesiastes. We might even notice that the key word of Ecclesiastes, havel, which is a short breath of a short breath, right? Nothingness. We might notice that the Hebrew word havel is used 3 times in this psalm. And that David is picking up on this wisdom literature, this sense of how fleeting life is. We might even go to James together if we were studying this psalm. And we might notice how James says in chapter 4 of his epistle, you are a mist that appears for a time and then is gone. And we might pause then and consider our own limitations. But we're not studying Psalm 39, so we're not going to do any of that this morning. Instead, because we're learning how to pray this psalm, let us notice together what David does with the burning questions that are inside of him. In the first stanza, he says, I have these burning questions, and when I muse over them, they only get hotter inside of me. Let us notice then, because we're learning how to pray, what David does with his complaints, what he does with these questions inside of him. The suffering is not going away. The questions are not going away. What does he do with this very real Job-like angst? What are the first 2 words of stanza 2? Oh, Lord. Oh, Lord. David brings all of his questions, all of his distress, all of his angst to God. He brings it to God. And that's what separates a prayer of distress with just complaining. It's what separates a prayer of distress from mere fatalism or whining. David comes to a fork in the road. He's experiencing distress and suffering. And he could take one turn and take his angst and his questions and just fume alone with them, which would lead to depression, which would lead to fatalism. Or he could take another turn and he could take his questions and his angst and his suffering to God, which in this case, as the psalm teaches us, actually leads to hope. And that's the turn that David takes, and that's the lesson for us. How do you pray Psalm 139? Be honest about the distress and the questions that you have. Number 2, when you hit that season of distress and you're honest about it, rather than staying by yourself and having everything boil up inside of you, let God have it. Let Him have it. Say, "O Lord," and then let it all spill out, just like David does in stanza 2. For David, it leads to hope, and hope is very different than fatalism. Now, if we're studying this psalm, we might move on to stanza 3 and notice what a compact, helpful lesson stanza 3 is in thinking about and understanding human suffering. We all question suffering, and we might notice what a helpful lesson this is in understanding suffering. We might note that Psalm 39, which we are in, seems to be naturally and purposefully paired with Psalm 38, the psalm just before it. We could even pause and we could reflect on the similar phrases and order of things that come up in the two psalms, Psalm 38 and 39, and notice that it is kind of a 1-2 punch on human suffering. If we were studying this psalm, we could notice that Psalm 38, David, it is a prayer of distress because of suffering caused by David's enemies and David's friends. And we could contrast that and compare that with this psalm, Psalm 39, which is also a prayer of distress, also because of suffering, but not suffering that is caused by friends or enemies, as we saw in Psalm 38. But in this psalm, in the 3rd stanza, we see that David's suffering is caused by 2 things. Number 1, David's own sin is causing him suffering. Verse 8, David says, "Deliver me from all my transgressions. Do not make me the scorn of the fool." You see, David humbly realizes, I've messed up. I've made some bad decisions. I've transgressed. And if I sit alone in what I've caused, even fools are going to make fun of me because of what I've done. And David realizes that he needs help out of the suffering that he himself has caused. But that's not the only cause of suffering in this psalm. The second cause of suffering? God. Verse 9, "I am mute. I do not open my mouth. For it is you who have done it," he says. "You have caused my distress." David realizes that some of his distress that he needs help out of is caused by God himself. Verse 10, "Remove your stroke from me, God. I am spent by the hostility of your hand." Now, if we're studying this psalm, we might reflect on what this and the companion psalm have to teach us about human suffering. That sometimes people suffer because of people around them. You don't have to raise your hand or point, but sometimes we suffer because of our enemies. Sometimes we suffer, as we see in Psalm 38, because of our friends. And sometimes we suffer, as we see in this psalm, because we've done silly and foolish things. Because we've made bad decisions. Sometimes we cause our own suffering, and sometimes our suffering is caused by God's parental discipline of us. We could even read Hebrews 12, where the preacher there reminds God's people that God only disciplines those he loves. And we might read further in Hebrews 12 how no discipline is pleasant at the time, but rather it's painful. It feels like suffering. But later on, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace. That God, as a parent, will discipline his children, even though it hurts for a time, because he knows that it will lead to something beautiful for them in the future. We could use stanza 3 of Psalm 39 as a kind of helpful rubric for thinking about and reflecting on human suffering and the different kinds of human suffering. But we're not studying Psalm 39, so we won't do any of that this morning. We're learning how to pray this psalm, and so instead let us notice that what David does about his suffering. He asks God to deliver him. He asks God for help. Again, it's David's instinct to go to God, and then it's David's instinct to ask for help. In Psalm 38, when David is lamenting the pain caused by friends and enemies, he asks for God to deliver him from that distress. Here in Psalm 39, when he recognizes that some of his distress is because of his own sins, he asks for God to deliver him from his transgressions. And when even some of his suffering, he recognizes, is caused by God's loving discipline, he even asks for God to deliver him from that. David asked for help, for God to deliver him from all his suffering. He says even at one time, remove your stroke from me. Save me from your discipline and from the distress of that. We learn from this in terms of praying and how to pray that it is right, it is natural, it is healthy, it is righteous even to call out to God to deliver you from your distress. Help me is a fine Christian prayer to pray. Now, if we were studying Psalm 39, we might at this point turn our thoughts to stanza number 4 and consider redemptive history a little bit. There's some meaty stuff in stanza 4 that we could get into to reflect on the continuity and discontinuity between David and us as New Testament Christians. We could reflect on the continuity that we and David have a lot in common. Verse 12, hear my prayer, O Lord, and give ear to my cry. Hold not your peace at my tears. There's a continuity that exists between David and us. We, just like David, follow a God that we can call out to and say, don't hold your peace at my tears. Help me, Lord. But we could also reflect on some of the discontinuity. There are some ways that we are in a different time in redemptive history, and on this side of Calvary, as New Testament Christians, there are some things that are different between David and us. Specifically, related to David's request for respite from his sin and God's discipline on his sin. In verse 13, David prays something very interesting. He prays this, look away from me, God. Look away from me, that I may smile again before I depart and am no more. You see, David knows that he has sinned. He knows that he is under the discipline of God because of it. And so his natural request is, God, would you look away from me? Would you not look at my sin? Otherwise, there's no hope for me. And this is where the situation with us and David is different. On this side of Calvary, we don't need to ask God to look away from our sin and to look away from us. As Paul put it in Colossians, for you have died and your life is hidden with Christ in God. Because of Jesus' sacrifice for us, because of what happened on Calvary, our sins are atoned for. We don't need God to look away. Because when he looks at us, he sees us clothed in the righteousness of Jesus. We are still in the need of parental guidance and leadership and even discipline from time to time. But we are in a place of hope because we are clothed in righteousness. We could reflect on redemptive history in that way if we were studying the psalm, but we're not. And because we're learning how to pray the psalm, instead, let's notice how tender the details are in the final stanza, where David here mentions King David, the great warrior David, mentions that he is crying. He's not just crying out to God, he's crying. David mentions his tears, and he doesn't hide them from God. God sees his tears. The final lesson for us as we learn to pray this is that God is not afraid of crying. God is not afraid of tears. We can go to him even when the times are tough. There are times when our crying alone is prayer, and our God can handle that. If you're going through distress right now, my sister who sent that email, for example, there's a great lesson that we have here in the 4 stanzas. Don't hide your distress or your questions. Muse over them. Don't be afraid of them. Number 2, take it to God. Take all of it to God. Number 3, ask for help. Ask God to help you. And number 4, sometimes crying itself is a coherent prayer that our God can handle and answer. If you're not in a season of distress, take notes. Note in your mind, Psalm 39, there's this way that we can bring our prayers to God, because the time will come when you will need to pray Psalm 39. There will come a time when you'll need to take the fork in the road and either get alone and curl in on yourself with your distress, or have the muscle memory to have a sense of how to bring it to your God. And friends, that's the better road to take. That is the redemptive road. It is the road of comfort. It is the road of wisdom. I love how Henry Light wrote about this in 1847. 1847, Henry Light wrote these words, a prayer to God, abide with me. Fast falls the eventide. Abide with me, God, because I know the sun's going down. The darkness deepens. Lord, with me abide. When other helpers fail and comforts flee, help of the helpless, oh, abide with me. That is the yearning of Psalm 39. That is the prayer of distress for those who are in trouble. Friends, will you stand with me? Turn to hymn 365 and let us exercise this prayer of distress in song.